Photography snobs, we've all come across them at some point in our careers, and if you're just starting out, eventually you will come across these people. They're basically the type of people that hang out in galleries and camera clubs, online Facebook photography groups and all forms of social media, and all they ever seem to do is try to appear artistically and intellectually superior to everyone else. And they'll tell you things like you shouldn't use automatic modes on your camera because manual is superior, and you shouldn't use zoom lenses because prime lenses are superior, and you should never, ever crop your photographs. I think it's about time we had a look at all this. Now, before we get started, just a very, very quick announcement to let you know that we've just released a couple of zines, one from me and one from Sarah. I'll leave all of the details in the description below. Basically, Sarah's zine, this one called Made in England, is a light-hearted look at our fellow countrymen and includes a lot of her best-known photographs from her street photography and documentary projects. Mine contains photos from a series of trips that I made over the past couple of years to London and focuses on the areas around Oxford Street, Soho, Chinatown and the West End. And also, we've just released our 2025 street photography workshop dates, and again I'll leave a link to those in the description below. Now, a lot of things that I've heard over the years from photographers who want to try and be superior in some way tend to go against everything that I've ever known as a professional photographer. I've always wanted the picture taking process to be as intuitive and as easy as possible so that I can concentrate wholly on taking the photographs. When photographs are your main source of income, the mindset of trying to put hurdles in front of you, trying to make things harder just because it's seen as being a superior way of working in some circles, just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Photography isn't a competition. Your photographs don't get more points if you shot them in manual, for example, or if you didn't crop them. A good photograph is a good photograph, no matter how you shot it or what you did to the photograph afterwards. And a bad photograph doesn't become a good photograph just because you happen to take it in a certain way. Now, when I've done one-to-one portfolio reviews with photographers, I often come across this mindset almost manifesting itself within the choices that photographers are making about their photographs. So, for example, a photographer might have a decision to make between photograph A and photograph B, which one do they prefer to go into a portfolio or a competition or an exhibition or a book? And sometimes the decision on which one they prefer has nothing to do with the photograph as such. It's to do with how they took the photograph. So, for example, if they've got a photograph that was taken manually, they might subconsciously want to prefer that over a photograph that was taken with an automatic exposure setting on their camera. So this kind of thing is starting to appear quite a bit in terms of photographic thinking. And it needs to stop. It really does need to stop. How you took the photograph is irrelevant to everybody apart from certain types of individuals that sit on Facebook photography groups. It's totally irrelevant. You have to use what works for you. It doesn't matter what camera you use. It doesn't matter what lens you use, whether you shoot film or digital, whether you use manual, whether you use program, whether you use aperture priority, shutter priority. It doesn't matter. All of this is completely irrelevant. Photography is all about self-expression, and you use whatever you need to use to fulfill that self-expression. And that includes cropping. Now, when I started taking photographs for a living, I was using Hasselblad cameras. So the cameras were basically square format. In the 1990s, most forms of presentation were actually rectangular. And also in the darkroom, it wasn't at all cost effective to try and pin square pictures onto rectangular 8x10 pieces of paper. It was really wasteful. So I always cropped my square images. And this was really quite a common thing at the time. A lot of professional photographers did this. So I grew up photographically right from those early years with the notion that cropping was actually an essential part of photography and an essential part of me making a living as a photographer. And I've never really had any issue with cropping ever since. And I just wanted to kind of see how nonsensical this whole idea of not cropping is. And a lot of this kind of nonsense has been spouted by one of the world's greatest ever photographers, Mr. Cartier-Bresson. There is a photograph, a very famous photograph, which I'll find in this book here. It's this one. Okay, and you'll have seen this many, many times. Okay, it's probably his most famous photograph, and it's probably one of the 20th century's most famous photographs. It's a crop. Okay, and Cartier-Bresson, I've got a lot of his books, and I've got some of his books where he talks about philosophy and he talks about his technique and stuff. And one of the things he's really adamant about is not cropping. Okay, and yet here we are. Perhaps his most famous photograph is a crop. And I've seen the negative. Well, I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen some pictures of the negative. And this is quite a serious crop. He's taken about 25% of the image away in order to get this. And if you don't know the story, basically he saw a gap in a fence and he took this photograph through the gap in the fence, and the fence was included in the original photograph, and obviously he cropped it out because he didn't want it there. And as much as I like Bresson, this is one of the things that really infuriates me about him. You know, he seems to have these set of rules and ideals which people jump on. Oftentimes they're just fantasy. You know, they're all part of an image which he wanted to portray as the, you know, the world's greatest photographer in the 20th century. Now, one of Cartier-Bresson's fellow Magnum photographers and one of his friends, Elliott Erwitt, produced this photograph. Now, this iconic photograph of the Chihuahua and the feet is actually a 35mm crop from a 6x6 negative. He's literally cropped 70% of the image out in order to get this. Now, if we take William Klein's style, his gritty, grainy style of photography came out of the heavy cropping of his negatives. He was once talking in a documentary about how when he first started, particularly when he went to New York, that he would have a camera with a wide angle lens on it, and if he saw something happen on the other side of the street, he would take the photograph knowing that he could blow it up or essentially crop it when he came to actually make a print. His idea was, do I take the photograph and knowing that I can enlarge it up, or do I not take the photograph at all and miss the opportunity of getting a good picture? Obviously, Klein, he's a little bit more free thinking, a bit more of a rebel than a lot of photographers, particularly, you know, during the mid sort of 20th century. And he didn't seem at all to be concerned about any kind of photography rules as such. You know, he was just somebody, a bit of a free spirit, and he decided to do what he wanted to do, and to hell with everybody else. If you have a 28mm lens and you see a shot happen which may be a few meters further away than you would like it to be in order to fill the frame, do you take that photograph knowing that you can effectively crop it later on, or do you say, no, I've got to stick to the rigid, you know, rule of never cropping and not take the photograph at all? To me, you're better off having the photograph than you're not having the photograph. Restricting yourself by this kind of unwritten rule of not cropping, I don't know, it just blows my brain. I just don't understand why people would restrict themselves to this. Now, here's a good question for you. Let me know in the comments what you think about this one. Who determines what shape a photograph should be? Is it the camera manufacturer, or is it the photographer? Because if you take a photographer like the great Chinese photographer Fan Ho, he shot everything with a Rolleiflex, and obviously it was square format. And yet if you ever see any of his work, if you are rich enough to afford one of his books, you will see that his pictures are all over the place in terms of crop. A lot of the crops don't actually correspond to what we would consider classic proportions. You know, he's got very thin images and almost square images and all sorts of rectangles going through his work. Now, of course, before everybody starts having a go at me in the comments, for practical reasons, we always want to try and get everything perfectly right in the viewfinder. And I'm not suggesting people for 1 minute should give up on trying to use the entire frame. All I'm saying is that there will be times when taking a photograph, knowing that it will be cropped afterwards, is the right thing to do. And that if you stick to something so rigid as never cropping your photos, you'll be doing your photography a disservice and ultimately missing out on any number of good pictures. And also, there are a number of practical considerations too when it comes to cropping. If you wear glasses like I do, you don't always see all of the edges of the viewfinder. Particularly with Leica M cameras, you know, your glasses as they sit against the actual camera push your eye further away from the viewfinder lens, so you can't actually see all of the edges of the frame that clearly. It's almost like you've got some vignetting going on. So you may see, particularly in my case, you may see something like 80% of the full frame at best. There'll be things on the edges sometimes with particular lenses that I won't see. And if you have a Leica rangefinder, you'll know that the frame lines are notoriously inaccurate, which again causes problems, particularly if you're shooting quite close to, you know, the frame lines can be a little bit out, to say the least. So cropping, again, will allow you to show the viewer what you actually saw and not necessarily what the camera saw. And as I've mentioned many a time, time in these videos, one of the reasons why we use these little viewfinders on the top of our cameras is so that we can actually see the frame easily rather than trying to rely on the internal frame lines. Cropping for me has always been an essential part of the creative process, and I guess if certain people are offended by that, or they think it makes me a lesser photographer because I crop my images from time to time, well, that's their problem. You know, I really don't care what they think. But what I can't fathom is why somebody would be so triggered by a photographer's creative process in the first place, which some people are. You know, we get that all the time on YouTube in some of the comments. You know, if you're somebody who can't take a photograph, but you need to impose your superiority onto somebody else by restricting the way that you do things, that's up to you. Just don't comment on this video if you're like that, please. Okay, cool. I have several books here by the Magnum Photo Agency as a collective. Obviously, I've got lots of books by Magnum photographers, but as a collective, I've got a number of books. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not really a fan. I got most of mine when I first started collecting books many, many years ago, and I'm not really into them. You know, they tend to be cobbled together best-ofs. But anyway, back in 2011, Magnum actually did produce a book which is worthy of spending some time and some money on. This is it. This is Contact Sheets. This is a first edition printed in 2011. It's stupid money now if you want to get a pristine first edition of this particular book. But in 2017, they released a smaller softcover version, which I'll link to in the description below, which you can get for around £30 to £40, which, given the quality of this book, is actually incredibly good value. In this book, you'll see the final photographs as they intended to be printed, alongside the path the photographer took to get that photograph. And it's really quite fascinating. The photographer, if they were still alive when the book was being published, also comments on the photograph and goes through their thought processes and backgrounds to the images. Seeing the finished print as well is really fascinating to me. With the Contact, you can see the flat image, but it's only when you see the final photograph you realise how much interpretation goes into that print. Overall, the print quality and the design of the book is very good, certainly in my version. And as I don't have the reprint, I can't say it's exactly the same, but I imagine it is. Now, there are a couple of disappointments in here. Mr. Cartier-Bresson doesn't show his full contact sheet. I think it was a standing joke at Magnum. Certainly Elliott Erwitt's mentioned it in the past that Henri never showed his contact sheets to anybody. And obviously, you know, you can't have the world's greatest photographer showing stuff that's, you know, not up to the world's greatest photographer standards, can we? So I'm assuming that's the reason for that. There's no colour work from Alex Webb, which I found really kind of weird. There's just a bizarre bunch of black and white images. And there's no Harry Gris artwork in here either. In fact, the colour work overall is quite limited. It's quite thin on the ground. But in spite of this, you know, this book is well worth getting. It's really the only book of its kind out there. And if you're prepared to spend the time to look through the pages, you're prepared to spend the time to look through the contact sheets, to look at the prints and see how it all works and read the photographer's notes which they made, you will learn a lot. So from that point of view alone, this is worth getting. But for me, one of the things I really took away from this book when I first got it was that it also shows how legendary photographers can still screw up things like exposure, framing and timing. Well worth getting. It's a really, really good book. It's the best book Magnum have ever produced, and it's a real fascinating insight into seeing the way that some of the great photographers of our time actually worked. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. As ever, if you like this video, we would love to see you subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions, any comments on anything that we've talked about in this video, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.